Alrighty, meet Antonio. At some point or another, if you're thinking about getting into speaker box building, you might land up like him. Alone, naked, holding something big black and 8 inches in your hand, asking yourself, where did I go wrong? Speaker box designing might seem very complicated, but it is not. And yet at the same time, there are some mistakes that a lot of new speaker box designers and builders kind of experience, which sometimes can feel like you don't understand anything at all, and yet you're an intelligent human being. So this video is going to be about some advice and what you can do and the things you should possibly try and understand before you jump into the art of crafting your first ghetto blaster.
10.
Let's go for main engine start.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And booster ignition and liftoff of Space Shuttle Discovery, taking the space station to full power for full science.
This is Mission Control Houston.
Discovery roll program.
Roger roll, Discovery.
Discovery's roll maneuver is complete. It is now in a heads down position on track for its flight to the International Space Station.
So we've just started launching your career in speaker box design, and the first thing that we often overlook is something called loudness. Loudness is derived by two basic characteristics on a specification page of any driver, one of which we naturally assume is power handling. Yes, power handling goes a long way, but it really is a sign of potential power, right? We can only store so many watts up in that speaker before it gets too hot and it melts. Just like with lights, the brightness of the light is not necessarily determined by the amount of watts. Watts is kind of the amount of power used. The actual brightness is measured in lumens. Speakers kind of have the same factor going for it, and this is something that's not necessarily understood. For every 1 watt we put into our speaker, we are going to get a certain amount of SPL measured at 1 meter away. This we refer to as the driver sensitivity. So if you are comparing two speakers and both of them fit within your price point, try and have a look at the driver sensitivity. A driver with more sensitivity is in fact going to be louder for every 1 watt worth of input power we put into our speaker. It is important to understand that 10 dBs is twice as loud perceived to our ears. So if you're listening to one sub and you want to be twice as loud, it is important that it's not just going to be a case of adding another sub. You in fact need to add more than one sub. In often instances, it's about 4 drivers to really become twice as loud. Keep that in mind. The next thing about power is it's important to understand that, yes, I don't know where you guys get this information from, but it's the right path but the wrong execution, I'm afraid. When we talk about amplifiers and we turn up an amplifier by a further 3 dBs, yes, we are increasing the power potentially coming from the amplifier 2 times of what we had initially. So if it was 100 watts, we're now potentially doing 200 watts. That is not twice as loud. Again, we need to recover 10 times more power. In other words, if we were 100 watts and we want to be twice as loud, we need to step that up to 1,000 watts. Now, Antonio has the secondary complaint, and this is possibly the one thing that goes hand in hand with loudness. So these two things, if you can overcome, the likelihood is you are going to dramatically have a better hi-fi building experience. And it relates to bass. Not only are a lot of projects not as loud as people anticipated, but in most instances there is not as much bass as you were hoping for. Even though you understand that all the low and sub frequencies were available to you as a speaker box designer with the driver that you're using, somehow the bass just isn't really there. Now you can see I'm comparing two very similar speakers. We can actually assume that they are the same thing, because in fact they are. What I have done is I've just given the secondary driver a little bit more cone displacement. This is one of the graphs that a lot of people have a tendency to underlook completely, and I don't really know why. A lot of the times when we're looking at our relative frequency response, we only consider the driver's on-axis normalized amplitude response, which in fact is a great way of looking at how low and where things start to roll off, but it does not take into consideration how much cone displacement and how much potential power we have available to us. So keep that in mind, is that a driver that has more cone displacement, typically speaking, as you can see visually on the graph, has a better radiating power from that enclosure because it can move more air for the same amount of watts that go into the driver. As you would intuitively think, if we had two speakers that we were comparing, one would be an 8-inch driver, the other one being an 18-inch driver, they might look identical in terms of their frequency response as well as their loudness because we set them up that way. But there certainly would be a different experience when you are listening to an 18 because it is radiating far more energy into the environment than our little driver. So what I've done to try and help indicate how low do you really need to go, well, it kind of draws down to a couple of things. Having one speaker is not as good as having two speakers. If you're going to be using a smaller driver, consider doubling up, especially if you're looking for lower frequency. This is one of the big differences when we start comparing things like small bookshelf speakers to floor standing speakers. Floor standing speakers invariably will have two or more of the same driver to help reinforce some of that low frequency. Right, now here is a cool thing, and a big shout out to Jake and Brooks for putting together a little audio sample of which we have actually removed some bass. And the point of this exercise is I want you to try and use your ears and listen very closely. And what we're going to be doing is we are going to be playing you short little snippets of a song, and we are going to play one firstly with nothing removed in terms of low frequency. And slowly but surely we are going to change that, and we are going to go from a full range signal with all the bottom end of the sub bass being present to slowly removing some of that bass. And what you'll find is that you are not necessarily going to hear such a vast difference as you thought you possibly would. This is a good indicator to often consider when you are designing a speaker, that just because it can go low, in fact it doesn't mean you should necessarily go that low. And on the back end of things, we are going to start to remove high frequency, because there are a lot of good products on the markets that get overlooked purely because they don't understand that the same rule that applies to bass kind of applies to treble at the same time, only the impact is far greater than what you might realize, and it can be the difference between a good speaker sounding okay versus a good speaker sounding fantastic. So here we go. Make sure that you've turned this up nice and loud and you've got your headphones on, and see if you can really pick out what the difference is in your perceived difference in bass. Now that's possibly not as easy as you would have thought. Removing quite a bit of the low end sub bass does not really make such a big impact as a lot of people were anticipating. To make this more interesting, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove the visual cues and mix things up a little bit. And I want to see if you can get the order of our samples correct. So try and leave your comments down in the section and I will let you know if you were right or if you're wrong in the comments. So let's go ahead and mix this up and see if you can work out which order we are playing things. not as easy as you would think, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Well, in truth, I'm going to tell you exactly what is where and, maybe be a bit of a spoiler. But the only samples that we had swapped was in fact our first and our last files. The last file having the least amount of base, which is now playing first in this last batch of samples with no visual cue as to what is happening. That was it. That's the only move we made. So it is a very important indicator to understand, guys, that going for the deepest possible base response sometimes is not necessarily as important. Remember, the larger the box, the easier it is for that speaker invariably to move backwards and forwards. And when it comes to trying to reach the overall power handling of our speaker, or the potential at least, sometimes going in a big box that is tuned very low actually works out slightly counterintuitive to what you may anticipate. So you've got to make a sacrifice, find the middle ground, and don't tune as low as you possibly could, because you most likely are going to be missing out on a little bit of energy in the upper bass region. And within that example, hopefully you have started to realize that going very low, especially once we sink in below 60 hertz or 50 hertz, that bottom end requires really big speakers to be able to play back, really thick, rich bass response. So using small speakers, consider tuning up a little higher. Generally, as a rule of thumb, if a driver has an FS of, let's say, 35 hertz, I will typically tune the driver at least 10 to 15 hertz above that, depending on the application. So hopefully that will give you some form of idea as a starting place. Tune a little bit higher, and keep into consideration the likelihood is you couldn't tell the difference to what we've just done here. So in reality, it's going to translate to pretty much the same thing. So Antonio, hopefully you realize that tuning too low might have very well been the culprit in why your bass sounds potentially anemic, pushing your little driver too far. But on the flip side of things, let's jump into high frequency, because this is quite interesting. High frequency a lot of the times isn't necessarily looked at in the same way as trying to achieve good bass response. So we're going to do the same exercise with high frequency. We are going to remove some of the highs at various intervals with visual cues, and then I'm going to change things up, remove the visuals, and I want you to try and guess which is which. Now again, removing the visual cues, can you guess which order we are playing our samples, whereby we are removing some of the high frequency at a constant rate? This one is definitely not going to be as easy for a lot of you as the bass. If you got any of them right, congratulations. But especially if you're a little older, this one's going to become complicated very fast. So go on and give it a try. Tell me which order we have changed things. Not so easy, is it now, Captain? Of course, high frequencies, as you get older, we don't hear them as well. So that is just a very small part of things, and typically speaking, depending on how and what we're playing back on, high frequencies can, just like our bass, be quite tricky to manage effectively. It's important to understand that when you are comparing high frequency devices, if the manufacturer is providing things like the off-axis response, it is critical to keep that into consideration. Just because one speaker has a better, flatter frequency response overall, you need to take in mind what is happening off-axis. Off-axis is basically not looking at the speaker directly head-on, because after all, we can't sit in the perfect spot the whole time listening to a set of speakers. Ultimately, when speakers are playing back, we invariably have them in some form of environment, and we ourselves are not going to be sitting necessarily on the same position or directly in front of the speakers. So consider how important the driver's off-axis response is. In many instances, this is overlooked, and I'm going to show you an extreme variation of that by taking a slightly higher roll-off and comparing that to a driver which plays higher up in frequency, but its off-axis response is not necessarily as good. Here you will notice the dramatic impact, and I want you to try and guess what is happening with the roll-off rates. This is typically something, again, that we never really consider, but is absolutely crucial when trying to build better speakers. You can clearly hear that the first sample indeed has far less high frequency presence than our secondary sample. Beyond any reasonable doubt, I'm sure, regardless of where you're playing this back, you can definitely hear the first sample has very little high frequency. The second sample has far better high frequency and generally sounds better. But if I was to ask you which one of those samples actually started to lose high frequency sooner, well, it would be the second option. While this might not sound very intuitive because of what you've heard, it is important to understand that this is a reflection of off-axis response. Sometimes a speaker might play very flat on axis, but off axis, like with our first sample, the frequency starts to disappear quite rapidly, and it's that rapid change in frequency that we really can differentiate on. Here is a graph to show you exactly what is the difference between sample A and sample B while we play them back to you. So not so simple, guys. You need to understand that the amount of energy in different frequency ranges really can complicate how much of that is present at any given point. You can see that the one graph definitely has more high frequency range before it starts to fall off, but it tanks pretty fast, roughly at a rate of 18 dBs per octave, while our secondary option has far less high frequency range. I mean, they're both going out to 20 kilohertz in theory, but the one starts to roll off far sooner than the other. It is important to keep that in mind when you are looking at speakers, that when you are looking at the driver's on-axis response, try and consider what the off-axis response is. The more gradual and gentle that falls off as we start to go from an on-axis response to 15, 30 and 45 degrees, the better things generally are going to sound to your ears as you're moving backwards and forwards in and around the room. So there you go. There are some basic things that noobs make as you get into speaker box design and selecting and designing your components. Hopefully you found this video informative, and let me know in the comment section what else you would like me to kind of run through. From myself, Gareth, aka the Sound Guy, see you on the next video.